Welcome to the Federal Transit Administration's presentation on the core capacity improvements under the Capital Investment Grant Program. My name is Keisha Trent from the Office of Capital Project Development within the Office of Planning and Environment, and I will be guiding you through this presentation. There are 46 slides in this presentation, and the training will take just under an hour to complete. The first question you may ask is, what is core capacity? The Core Capacity Program was created by Congress in 2012 as a new type of eligible project within the Capital Investment Grant Program. This eligibility enables transit agencies to increase the capacity of existing fixed guideway transit corridors that are at or over capacity today or will be in 5 years. The pictures on this slide illustrate the types of conditions that can occur when corridors are at or over capacity: crowded platforms, passenger delays, and so-called crush loads on vehicles. The Core Capacity Program provides funding for corridor-based transit capital improvements that increase transit capacity by at least 10%, thereby providing more comfortable, safe, and efficient transit service. This presentation will cover 4 topics to provide you with a comprehensive understanding of core capacity projects undertaken through FTA's Capital Investment Grant Program. First, we will provide a general overview of the Capital Investment Grant Program and how core capacity projects fit into the overall program. Then we will explain core capacity project eligibility, the requirements for getting into and through the steps in the capital investment grant process, and the FTA evaluation and rating process. In between some of the informational slides, there will be question slides to help review what you have learned. First, let's start with a brief overview of the Capital Investment Grant Program, abbreviated here as CIG. The Capital Investment Grant Program is a very competitive discretionary grant program rather than a formula grant program. This means that Congress decides which projects get funding each year based on recommendations provided by FTA to Congress in an annual report that is a companion document to the President's annual budget submission. Our project recommendations are based on the results of our evaluations and ratings of the projects against the criteria specified in law, as well as considerations related to project readiness for construction funding. Historically, approximately $2 billion has been appropriated by Congress each year to the CIG program, with the historical average CIG share for most projects being 50% of the total project cost. The program is highly competitive. Demand for funding greatly exceeds the funding available. We currently have more than 60 projects competing for funding. Projects must go through a multi-year, multi-step process outlined in law before they can receive funds. FTA is required to evaluate and rate the projects at various points during the process according to criteria spelled out in the law. We will go into more detail on this process later in the presentation. The program has a successful history of investing in transit infrastructure around the country. As an example, in the last decade, the Capital Investment Grant Program has provided over $18 billion to dozens of new or extended transit systems throughout the United States. These transit capital projects are transformational to the regions they serve. They create economic development and opportunity and improve the quality of people's lives. There are 3 types of eligible projects under the Capital Investment Grant Program: New Starts, Small Starts, and Core Capacity. New Starts projects are new fixed guideway projects or extensions to existing fixed guideway systems with a total estimated capital cost greater than $300 million or that are seeking $100 million or more in CIG program funds. The law defines fixed guideway as using and occupying a separate right-of-way for the exclusive use of public transportation, using rail, using a fixed catenary system, for a passenger ferry system, or for a bus rapid transit system. Thus, eligible modes include heavy rail, light rail, streetcar, bus rapid transit, ferries, and commuter rail. Small starts projects are new fixed guideway projects, extensions to existing fixed guideway systems, or corridor-based bus rapid transit projects. Small starts projects must have a total estimated capital cost of $300 million or less and must be seeking less than $100 million in CIG program funds. And finally, core capacity projects are substantial corridor-based improvement projects that will expand capacity by at least 10% in an existing fixed guideway corridor that is at or over capacity today or will be in 5 years. Now that we have provided a brief overview of the CIG program, we will cover in more specific detail core capacity eligibility requirements. First, the law states that a core capacity project must be a substantial corridor-based capital investment in an existing fixed guideway system. A core capacity project cannot consist of system-wide improvements since the law specifies it must be corridor-based. Elsewhere in the law, a corridor is defined as a largely linear band defined by common travel markets. FTA allows as eligible under core capacity a corridor that might consist of a trunk line with several branches. To be eligible for core capacity funding, the law specifies that the project must be located in a corridor that is at or over capacity today or will be within 5 years. The project sponsor must also demonstrate that upon completion of the project will increase capacity in the corridor by at least 10%. Lastly, the law also states that core capacity projects cannot include elements designed to maintain state of good repair. We will go into more detail on this in the next few slides. The law specifies certain activities that are eligible for core capacity funds, including acquisition of real property and right-of-way, double tracking, signalization improvements, electrification, expanding system platforms, acquisition of rolling stock for increasing capacity, and infill stations. A project cannot include elements such as general station facilities, parking, or acquisition of rolling stock as standalone items. While these are eligible activities, they must be done in combination with other elements. By themselves, they are not eligible as a core capacity project. As stated on the previous slides, the law makes clear that core capacity projects cannot include elements designed to maintain a state of good repair. Similarly, the FTA State of Good Repair circular found on our website makes clear that projects that solely expand capacity or service are not eligible for FTA State of Good Repair formula funding. That circular goes on to say that FTA will permit expansion of capacity within State of Good Repair replacement projects only to meet current or projected short-term service needs, such as replacing a maintenance facility with a larger facility. However, FTA recognizes that many corridors that have capacity needs may also have state of good repair needs. In some cases, it may make sense for a project sponsor to undertake both types of capital improvements at the same time. For example, a project sponsor may desire to straighten and relocate some sections of track in a corridor to improve travel speeds and increase train throughput. This work would be eligible as core capacity improvements. However, there may also be sections of track located within the same corridor that need to be replaced to meet state of good repair needs. These sections would not be relocated or moved and by themselves would not contribute to an expansion of capacity in a corridor. All of this track work would typically be undertaken by a project sponsor as part of a single project, even though parts of this work are eligible for core capacity funding and other parts are not. Thus, FTA allows project sponsors to undertake both types of needed improvements together at the same time as part of the same project, but with various elements being funded with different FTA funding sources. On the next slide, we provide more information on how FTA accommodates this type of situation. While FTA allows projects that include both core capacity and state of good repair elements, FTA requires that the project sponsors differentiate the costs for purposes of determining which costs are eligible for each type of FTA funds. There is no prescribed approach for differentiating the state of good repair costs from the core capacity costs. Rather, the project sponsor submits a proposed accounting to FTA for review and approval. Once FTA and the project sponsor agree to a reasonable accounting approach, the percentages for each cost item are locked in. Revisions to the percentage breakdowns can then only be made when special extenuating circumstances arise. This guards against continuous recalculations that could delay a project from moving forward through the CIG program, and also from recalculations meant solely to try to improve a project's rating under the CIG evaluation criteria. Question time. Projects seeking core capacity funding must meet which of the following eligibility requirements? A, be located in a corridor that is at or over capacity or will be in 5 years. B, increase capacity by at least 10%. Or C, both A and B. The correct answer is, you guessed it, C, both A and B. In these next two slides, we discuss how FTA reviews whether a corridor is at capacity today or will be in 5 years to determine if it is eligible as a core capacity project in the CIG program. This slide discusses the calculation for heavy rail and light rail core capacity projects. FTA uses the average existing usable space per passenger in the peak hour in the pink direction as its measure of capacity for light rail and heavy rail projects. This is not a peak load point calculation. It examines peak hour, peak direction, average usable space per passenger along the entire length of the project corridor as identified by the project sponsor. FTA recognizes there are many different ways to measure capacity, but has chosen this method for simplicity in how it is calculated, for national consistency purposes, and for its use of readily available data. Project sponsors select the peak hour and the peak direction based on their system's usage characteristics. The Transit Cooperative Research Program, known as TCRP, Transit Capacity Manual, states that 5.4 square feet per passenger is the least amount of space for a comfortable standing load that retains space between passengers. It also says that 5.4 square feet is sometimes used as a peak hour design standard for new rail systems, trying to provide a higher quality of service that allows for easy circulation within the vehicle. Thus, if calculations from the project sponsor show that the current average usable space per passenger in the corridor is less than or equal to 5.4 square feet, the corridor is considered to be at capacity today. If the current average usable space per passenger is between 5.4 square feet and 5.7 square feet, then FTA assumes the corridor will be at capacity within 5 years. If the current average usable space per passenger is greater than 5.7 square feet, the project will not be eligible for core capacity funding because it is not currently at capacity and is not anticipated to be at capacity in 5 years. This slide shows a high-level representation of the calculation that is used to determine the average usable space per passenger for light rail and heavy rail projects. FTA has developed a spreadsheet template that automatically calculates the usable space per passenger based on a few simple inputs from the project sponsor. I will provide a snapshot of that template in a subsequent slide. Now, let's briefly walk through the steps of the calculation as shown on this slide. Project sponsors report the external length and width of the rail cars used in the corridor during the peak hour. From that information, the usable area per rail car is calculated. FTA subtracts 8 inches from the external width and 6 feet 7 inches from the external length of each rail car when calculating the usable area to account for space within the vehicle that is not usable by passengers, such as driver compartments. These standard factors for determining the usable space come from the same TCRP Transit Capacity Manual mentioned on the last slide. FTA does not allow project sponsors to calculate the usable space based on unique characteristics or features on their cars. This is for national consistency purposes. Project sponsors also report the number of trains per peak hour in the peak direction and the number of cars per train in the peak hour. These data are multiplied together to arrive at the total number of rail cars in the peak hour in the peak direction. The number of rail cars per peak hour in the peak direction is then multiplied by the usable area per car. The result is the total usable car area in the peak hour in the peak direction. The total usable car area in the peak hour in the peak direction is then divided by the total existing ridership in the corridor in the peak hour in the peak direction reported by the project sponsor to arrive at the average usable space per passenger. For commuter rail projects, FTA has a different calculation to demonstrate whether the corridor is at or above capacity today or will be in 5 years. Generally, commuter rail systems do not allow standees given the much longer trip lengths and for safety considerations. Thus, FTA's capacity calculation for commuter rail corridors is based on a simple seated load calculation. If 95% or more of the available seats are used during the peak hour in the peak direction, the corridor is considered to be at capacity today or will be in 5 years. This approach is easy to calculate and easy to verify, and it does not require extensive reviews by FTA to determine eligibility. So here is an example of the simple spreadsheet template FTA has created into which project sponsor enter information in the areas shown in white, and the spreadsheet automatically calculates the information in the column shaded in gray. These templates can be found on the FTA website. Project sponsors must ensure they meet the requirement in law that the project will increase capacity by at least 10%. This means for light rail and heavy rail projects, the usable space per passenger in the peak hour going the peak direction must be increased by at least 10% as a result of the implementation of the project. For commuter rail projects, the percent seated load in the peak hour going the peak direction must be decreased by at least 10% as a result of the project. Question time. If 95% or more of the available seats on heavy rail are used in the peak hour going the peak direction, the corridor is at capacity today or will be in 5 years. Is this true or false? The answer is false. The seated load calculation is used to calculate capacity on commuter rail only. That concludes the section on core capacity eligibility. Next, we will discuss the core capacity steps in the process. Now we will discuss the steps for getting into and through the CIG process. This flowchart displays the 3 steps or phases in the core capacity process that are defined in law: project development, abbreviated as PD, engineering, and a full funding grant agreement, abbreviated as FFGA. The boxes under each phase briefly outline the work performed during that phase. The yellow symbols denote points in time during the process that FTA must take formal actions. At the points in time when FTA is required to evaluate and rate the project, the yellow arrows, the project must receive a medium or better overall rating before it can proceed into the next phase. One important aspect of the process is that the law specifies the project development phase for core capacity projects must be completed within a 2-year time frame. So project sponsors should carefully time their entry into project development to ensure they can complete the activities within 2 years. We will now go into more detail on each of these steps in the next few slides. As just mentioned, the law requires that core capacity project sponsors complete the project development phase of the process within 2 years. Therefore, when deciding whether to seek entry into project development, project sponsors should first consider whether they can complete the items required by law within the 2-year time frame. This includes completing the environmental review process, selecting a locally preferred alternative, getting that alternative adopted into the region's fiscally constrained long-range transportation plan, and preparing the information necessary for FTA evaluation and rating. Project sponsors decide the right time to apply. FTA receives applications at any time throughout the year and does not require that they be submitted at any particular time. Project sponsors do not need to tie the timing of their entry into project development to FTA's preparation of the annual report on funding recommendations. In fact, it is best not to apply during that time, as FTA is very busy with those activities. Once you have decided to apply to enter project development, you need to submit a short 3 to 5 page letter addressed to the FTA Associate Administrator for Planning and Environment that includes the information outlined in our final interim policy guidance found on our website. The request letter should be submitted electronically to FTA for faster delivery. There is no standard format for the letter. Importantly, we do not want pages and pages of information. We want a short letter giving us a sense of the people and organizations that will be working on the proposed project, a map and corridor description if available, the transportation problem that is being addressed by the proposed project, the current transit service operated in the corridor, a description of the proposed project, including its cost and the amount of CIG funding being sought, if that is currently known, the cost to conduct the PD work, a high-level schedule that shows anticipated dates for completion of the environmental review process, selection of a locally preferred alternative, adoption of the locally preferred alternative into the fiscally constrained long-range transportation plan, entry into engineering, and receipt of a full funding grant agreement. Of particular importance is that the request letter demonstrate funding is available and committed to perform the project development work. In addition, the request must include the data we previously discussed in this presentation, showing the corridor is at capacity today or will be in 5 years, and that the proposed project will increase capacity by 10%. Without this information, we cannot determine whether the project is eligible for entry into the program. Within 45 days of receipt of a complete submittal, FTA will notify the project sponsor of entry into project development. We are required to notify Congress of the project's entry into project development concurrently with our notification to the project sponsor. As mentioned on the last slide, providing documentation to FTA that funding is committed to do the PD work is a key requirement for entry into PD. So we would like to spend a minute or two discussing the types of documentation that serve to demonstrate the commitment of funds. If federal funding will be used to pay for PD, FTA must be provided a copy of the Unified Planning Work Program or the Transportation Improvement Program showing the federal funds are programmed to the project. Please note that CIG funding is not available to assist with PD activities, although the cost of those activities can be reimbursed later with CIG funds when and if a full funding grant agreement is signed by FTA. If state or local funding will be used to pay for PD, the project sponsor should describe the source or sources being used and provide supporting documentation showing the commitment of those funds by the required officials. A statement that there is an intent to commit funds in the future is not sufficient. FTA needs to know that the money exists and is currently approved so that PD activities can begin as soon as the project enters the CIG program. Congressional intent is that these projects will move quickly through the process and complete PD within 2 years. If funding is not already available and committed to do the PD work, it is unlikely to be completed within the 2-year period. On this slide, we list some possible examples of supporting documentation that might demonstrate commitment of state or local funds, but each area is unique and these may or may not be applicable to your area's funding sources. It is important to remember that FTA is not evaluating and rating projects prior to allowing them to enter project development. Thus, entry into project development is not a statement of project merit or an indication that the project will receive CIG funding from FTA in the future. Rather, it simply means that you may continue planning your project. We encourage project sponsors not to tout entry into project development as a major milestone to the press and other local decision makers, as doing so misconstrues the process. Question time. Project development requests should be a short letter to the FTA Associate Administrator for Planning and Environment that includes, check all that apply, A, a map of the corridor being studied, B, a letter to the Transportation Secretary, C, a brief description of current levels of service, D, verification of capacity increase of the project, E, committed funds to do project development work. Pens down. The correct answers are A, a map of the corridor being studied, C, a brief description of current levels of service, D, verification of capacity increase of the project, and E, committed funds to do project development work. Great job! Once your project has entered project development, you must complete the following activities within the 2 years specified in the law. Complete the environmental review process as required under the National Environmental Policy Act. Select a locally preferred alternative known as the LPA. Get the LPA adopted in the region's fiscally constrained long-range transportation plan. Get the LPA approved in the Metropolitan Planning Organization's Transportation Improvement Program for the engineering and design phase if the project is located in an air quality conformity non-attainment area. Prepare the information needed by FTA to conduct its evaluation and rating of the project. Obtain commitments of at least 30% of the non-CIG funding, and complete at least 30% design and engineering work. While 30% design is the minimum level of design that must be completed during PD to gain entry into the engineering phase, FTA allows project sponsors to perform as much design as they wish during PD after the completion of the NEPA process to feel comfortable with the project cost estimate. As we stated repeatedly, 2 years is the length of time the law allows core capacity sponsors to complete project development activities. The law allows for an extension to the 2-year time frame at FTA's discretion. Our interim policy guidance states that FTA will consider granting extensions on a case-by-case basis. We expect extensions to be the exception rather than the norm. In other words, we expect they will be granted infrequently and only for extenuating circumstances. Our interim policy guidance also discusses an option project sponsors have of requesting to postpone entry into engineering after completing the activities required by law within the 2-year time frame. In the next 2 slides, we will discuss each and how they differ. But first, let's make clear that project sponsors should not wait until the last day of the 2-year period to submit information to FTA for evaluation and rating. Please work with FTA closely throughout PD, and especially in the last few months leading up to the end of the 2-year period, so there is a clear understanding of when information will be available and whether the timing works with FTA's process. If a project sponsor believes it will be unable to complete the PD activities specified in the law within the 2-year time frame, the sponsor should request an extension of PD from FTA. The project sponsor should provide FTA with a letter explaining the reasons the extension is needed and a revised schedule for when the PD activities expected to be completed. The letter should explain the reasons for the delay. An electronic submittal of the letter is preferred by FTA. There is no specific format for the letter, as each situation will be unique. After receiving the letter, FTA may contact the sponsor for additional information before making its decision. FTA will respond in writing, either approving or denying the extension. If an extension is not granted, the project will be withdrawn from PD. The project sponsor will be required to complete the PD work activities before the project would be allowed to reapply for entry into engineering phase of the CIG program. Any work performed after withdrawal from PD and prior to re-entry into engineering would not be covered by pre-award authority and would not be eligible for reimbursement at a future date should FTA later award a full funding grant agreement. If a project sponsor completes the PD activities within the 2-year time frame, but wants more time to perform additional work to feel comfortable locking in the CIG amount, which occurs at entry into engineering, the sponsor may request to postpone entry into engineering. Requests to postpone entry into engineering are only considered if the project sponsor has completed all of the required PD work within the 2 years specified in law. An electronic submittal of the letter requesting to postpone entry into engineering is preferred by FTA. There is no specific format for the request. However, the request should provide FTA with documentation verifying the PD activities have been completed and an estimated schedule for when the project sponsor believes the project will be ready to advance into engineering. FTA will begin formal oversight of the project no later than 6 months prior to entry into engineering or 6 months prior to the end of the 2-year PD timeframe, whichever is earlier. Thus, project sponsors must notify FTA of their intent to enter engineering at least 6 months prior to when they hope to enter. FTA encourages project sponsors to begin working with us in advance of this notification date to establish an oversight plan and roadmap for entry into engineering. Once you've decided it is time to seek entry into engineering, you should review the list of items outlined in our final interim policy guidance as needed with your request. Typically, the FTA team working on the project outlines the necessary information during our ongoing discussions with you. Together, we prepare a project roadmap or timeline for completing the steps necessary to enter engineering. This slide outlines some of the basic elements required with your request to enter engineering, but please refer to the final interim policy guidance, the FTA reporting instructions for the core capacity program, and our entry into engineering checklist found on our website. As you work with FTA staff, they will be happy to direct you to where these materials can be found. FTA will use the information provided to develop our rating. By law, a project must receive a medium or better overall rating to be eligible for entry into the engineering phase. FTA will also review the project management plan and subplans to ensure that the project sponsor has the capacity and capability to carry out the project. Lastly, FTA will review the project definition, scope, cost, and schedule for reasonableness and undertake other appropriate oversight. These oversight reviews may be expedited based on factors including the complexity of the project and the project sponsor's management capacity and capability. Once FTA has completed its evaluation and rating and determined the project has met the requirements for entry into engineering, we send a formal notification letter to the project sponsor. The letter outlines the current estimated project cost and CIG amount and indicates that will be the maximum amount of CIG funding provided to the project even if the cost rises during engineering before the full funding grant agreement. The letter also outlines critical items that must be addressed by the project sponsor before FTA will consider awarding a full funding grant agreement. Shortly after the project enters the engineering phase, FTA will conduct several oversight reviews, including a financial capacity assessment. The financial capacity assessment will identify any concerns with the financial plan that will need to be addressed before a full funding grant agreement can be awarded. The financial capacity assessment includes stress tests of key variables to determine the project sponsor's ability to address funding shortfalls or cost increases. In addition to a financial capacity assessment, FTA will typically conduct a risk assessment soon after the project enters engineering. The risk assessment will identify concerns with the project's scope, cost, or schedule that need to be addressed prior to award of a construction grant. As we've mentioned previously, the law intends for projects to move more quickly through the program. In keeping with this intent, FDA's final interim policy guidance specifies that the project sponsor must demonstrate progress on the project within 3 years of entry into engineering. FDA defines progress as obtaining funding commitments for at least 50% of its non-CIG funds and advancing the project design. Projects that do not demonstrate sufficient progress will be withdrawn from the CIG program. If withdrawn from the program, the sponsor may apply for re-entry into engineering after gaining the necessary funding commitments and advancing design. Any work performed after the project is withdrawn and before it is re-entered into the program is not covered by pre-award authority and will not be reimbursed should a full funding grant agreement eventually be signed. Question time. Within 3 years of entering the engineering phase, project sponsors must check all that apply. A. Complete all third-party agreements. B. Obtain commitments of at least 50% of the non-CIG funds. C. Select a construction contractor. D. Advance the design of the project. Survey says the answers are B. Obtain commitments of at least 50% of the non-CIG funds, and D. Advance the design of the project. Before a project may receive a full funding grant agreement, it must be recommended for funding in the annual report on funding recommendations, which is a companion document to the President's budget request to Congress. Thus, when preparing the project schedule, project sponsors should ensure they have a clear understanding of the federal budget cycle and what is required to get a funding recommendation. Typically, FTA requests information in September to evaluate and rate projects wishing to be considered for a funding recommendation in the President's budget that gets released in February of the following year. That budget document covers the fiscal year that begins in October, following the budget's release in February. Thus, project sponsors submit information for evaluation and rating to FTA roughly 1 year in advance of when they hope to receive appropriations from Congress that can be used to award a full funding grant agreement. Keep in mind that congressional appropriations are not always received at the beginning of a given fiscal year. In recent years, appropriations have often been delayed. In order to receive a funding recommendation in the President's budget, projects must receive at least a medium overall rating. In addition, sufficient design must have been completed such that the project's scope, cost, and schedule are considered reliable. Generally, projects must also have at least 50% of the non-CIG funds committed. To receive a full funding grant agreement, the project must complete the steps outlined in law, project development, and engineering. The project must be evaluated and rated by FTA and receive a medium or better overall rating. The project must have been recommended for funding in the President's budget and generally have some CIG funding appropriated by Congress. On rare occasions, FDA has awarded an FFGA even without congressional appropriations having been received, but this is the exception rather than the norm. Before FTA will sign an FFGA with the project sponsor, all of the non-CIG funding must be committed to the project, all critical third-party agreements must be signed, and the project sponsor must demonstrate to FTA that the project cost, scope, and schedule are reliable and that they have the technical capacity to complete the project. Now that we have covered getting into and through the steps in the core capacity process, we will next discuss the core capacity evaluation and rating process. FTA rates projects on a 5-point scale from low to high. The law requires that projects receive a medium or better overall rating to advance through the process and receive a full funding grant agreement. At a minimum, core capacity projects are evaluated and rated twice, prior to entry into engineering and prior to receiving a full funding grant agreement. FTA also uses project ratings to decide whether to include a project as a funding recommendation in the President's budget. These are the core capacity evaluation and rating criteria that are outlined in the law and described in detail in FTA's final interim policy guidance. The law defines two types of criteria: project justification, which are the blue boxes, and local financial commitment, which are the green boxes. Ratings are assigned to each individual rating criterion via the 5-point scale mentioned on the last slide, with low being equal to a score of 1 and high being equal to a score of 5. The individual criterion ratings are then weighted as shown on this slide to develop the summary project justification rating and the summary local financial commitment rating. The summary ratings are then weighted equally to arrive at an overall rating. Note that to receive a medium or better overall rating as required by law, FTA requires that both the summary project justification and the summary local financial commitment ratings must be rated medium or better. The next slide describes in greater detail the measures used for each of the core capacity project justification criteria. The 6 project justification criteria in law for core capacity projects are mobility improvements, environmental benefits, congestion relief, cost effectiveness, economic development, and capacity needs of the corridor. Each is rated on a scale from low, 1, to high, 5, and given equal weight to arrive at a summary project justification rating. By definition, core capacity projects are in very successful transit corridors that already have the economic development to support transit usage and already provide environmental benefits by keeping people off the roadways. Therefore, we assign automatic medium ratings on those 2 criteria without the need for project sponsors to gather and report data to FTA unless they wish to obtain a better than medium rating. If a project sponsor chooses to seek a better than medium rating, they would submit the information requested of New Start's project sponsors for those 2 criteria. The other 4 criteria, mobility improvements, congestion relief, cost effectiveness, and capacity needs, all include ridership information in their calculations. Importantly, the measures use existing ridership in the corridor rather than a projection of future ridership. This eliminates the need for the project sponsor to prepare travel forecasts. FTA relies on ridership count data that is typically readily available for project sponsors. The calculations for the congestion relief and capacity needs criteria are similar to the core capacity eligibility evaluations we discussed earlier in the presentation. For cost effectiveness, we base the evaluation on the core capacity CIG share of the project only rather than total project cost. As said in the last slide, to calculate the evaluation criteria, we use the existing ridership in the corridor rather than projections of future ridership. Project sponsors submit the following information to FTA to document existing ridership in the core capacity project corridor: a map of the project showing the existing line or lines that pass through the corridor, existing average weekday and peak hour peak direction ons and offs for the corridor, and the methodology used to collect the data. Ridership data collection should be representative of an average weekday, which often means that they will be based on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, or Thursdays, since Mondays and Fridays may have differing ridership patterns. Additionally, they should not generally include weekdays when extra service is scheduled to meet special service needs such as civic celebrations, parades, or holiday events. FTA's core capacity reporting instructions, available on our website, provide instructions for documenting existing ridership. The law requires that core capacity projects be supported by an acceptable degree of local financial commitment. Accordingly, FTA considers the following measures when performing its evaluation and rating of the 20-year financial plan that is required from project sponsors. 1. The current capital and operating condition of the project sponsor, including an examination of average fleet age, bond ratings, the ratio of current assets to current liabilities from the most recent balance sheet, and whether there have been recent service cuts. 2. The amount of committed funds for the capital costs of the project and the transit system's operation and maintenance, including whether there is significant private participation. And 3, the reasonableness of the assumptions used in the financial plan and the project sponsor's capacity to withstand unexpected funding shortfalls or cost overruns. Each of the 3 is rated on a scale from low, 1, to high, 5. The first 2 are each weighted 25%, and the third is weighted 50% to arrive at a summary local financial commitment rating. The subfactor for financial capacity and reasonableness of the assumptions is given the most weight in the evaluation and rating process because the project sponsor's assumptions about the revenue and expense growth are the basic underpinnings supporting the entire financial plan. If the summary local financial commitment rating is at least medium and the Section 5309 CIG share is less than 50% of the project's capital costs, then FTA raises the summary local financial commitment rating 1 level. Generally, project sponsors are required to submit a 20-year financial plan, so FTA may evaluate and rate local financial commitment. However, some core capacity projects may qualify for a financial warrant, which eliminates the need to submit a 20-year financial plan and instead allows FTA to assign an automatic rating. To qualify for a financial warrant, the project cost must be less than $250 million. The project sponsor must demonstrate a reasonable plan to secure funding for the non-CIG funding or sufficient available funds for the non-CIG funding. The operating and maintenance cost of the project is less than 5% of the project sponsor's current operating budget, and the project sponsor's past 3 years' audited financial statements must demonstrate they are in good financial condition. Projects that meet the aforementioned specifications and are seeking 50% or more in CIG funding receive an automatic medium rating on local financial commitment. Projects that meet the aforementioned specifications and are seeking less than a 50% capacity share receive an automatic high finance rating. And now it's time for our final question. How is the overall project rating calculated? True or false? Is the project justification rating weighted 50% and the local financial commitment rating weighted 50%? The answer is true. The project justification and local financial commitment summary ratings are each weighted 50% to arrive at an overall project rating. That concludes our overview of the Core Capacity Program. For more information about the Capital Investment Grant Program, please visit FTA's website at www.transit.dot.gov or contact the Office of Planning and Environment at 202-366-4033.